Very pleased now to be joined by University of Guelph professor Alan Ker. He was recently named the Ontario Agricultural College Research Chair in Agricultural Risk and Policy. Congratulations, Alan. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very proud to hold the chair.
Awesome. Hey, now this is a new research role. Tell us about it. What's going to be your objectives sitting in this seat?
Yeah, sure. Basically, it boils down to the fact that agriculture has a lot of risk from a lot of different dimensions and different places like trade agreements, climate change, just production risk. And the focus of the chair is looking at how we can handle that in a more aggregate way through policy, as well as right on the farm where farmers, how do they handle that? And how do we make sure that policy is constructed in a way so that it doesn't sort of create adverse effects at the farm level in handling risk. And so the research with this chair will push along in those avenues, and that will follow into trade risk, as well as climate change risk, as well as the risk associated with the programs meant to handle the risk. And for those farmers who have dealt with that, they know exactly what we're talking about.
Now, you and I, we've talked about in the past the need to understand the impact of, both innovation and climate change on agriculture to formulate, good policy and risk mitigation. In what areas do we need to do more research? What do we need to know more about to make good policy?
Right. I think we need to understand more about how our current policies affect the behavior on the farm of producers, and how, while we're on the one hand trying to help producers mitigate the risk and handle the risk, how do we make sure that they still innovate and invest in ideas and technologies to help them do that on the farm without relying solely on the government to do that? And so, for example, if you take BRM policy in Ontario and Canada, it's very good, helps farmers mitigate a big part of the risk, production risk in the lower tail. But how do we make sure that they still care about that they're going to try to mitigate the effects of climate change? So finding that balance is very difficult and very tricky. And so that's an area where we need more research for sure. So that's one area specifically that we're looking at right now.
Now, you talk about business risk management, and risk management, amongst farmers these days, big conversations. Production insurance, agri-stability, the risk management program. Do some or all of these programs need to be revisited?
Yes, I think they do. In particular, producers are pretty happy with production insurance. But this is where a point where maybe we need some co-insurance going on here, where to help farmers innovate and do things on the farm that they can do to help mitigate risk. In terms of agri-stability, that program has not been well received and continues to not be well received. And so adjustments should definitely be handled there with respect to agri-stability. Because a program where there's no involvement isn't serving anyone. And so I'm not saying the involvement is at zero, it isn't, but it's not near to the level where I think the federal government was expecting it to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, a real tough fall harvest here in Ontario this year. From a policy perspective, is there anything we can learn from, I guess, the high levels of dawn that growers have been experiencing in the corn crop this year?
Yeah, we do. Most of the growers do have production insurance. How that is actually going to be handled within that program, there's still some uncertainty of how that's going to be handled. And going through this experience this year hopefully solidifies how we're going to handle these type of events in the future, so farmers can plan accordingly. So that is the thing that I hope comes out of this year's experience.
When we're talking risk mitigation, Alan, production is only part of the conversation. Trade policy, trade environments, are going to play such a big role. The USMCA, trade talks with China right now. Might that prove to be the most difficult when it comes to managing risk?
Yes, I think it is, in the sense that a particular farmer in Grey County in Ontario can do nothing to mitigate that risk in terms of a trade agreement with China or what goes on with the USMCA. And especially now, these trade agreements seem to not be as solid as they were in the past, in terms of there's a great deal of uncertainty going on in the trade environment these days, and uncertainty at levels that we haven't experienced in quite a while. And so this is going to be difficult to mitigate these things down at the farm level. And yet, they can be very, very impactful at the farm level. So I would say this is one of the more difficult issues in terms of managing risk for farmers these days.
Now, lots of action these days on the climate change policy front. Ontario and the federal government are at loggerheads on the carbon tax. And I noticed in the new Ontario plan, it calls for province-wide assessment on the impacts of climate change. I'm just wondering, will you be advising the Ford government on their policies going forward? And, what can you tell them? Can you help these governments?
Yeah, if I'm asked, I certainly will. Yet to be asked, but I am part of the Ontario BRM review team that is tasked with dealing with how are we handling the risk, and part of that risk is from a changing climate. And so how will I be advising them? That gets back to the delicateness of having these BRM programs that help cover a big swath of the risk, while still having not changing farmers' decision on the farm to help mitigate that risk. And finding that balance is going to be difficult. And for example, there's some anecdotal evidence out there that seed technologies are being developed. This is in the private sector, and that of being more high risk, high reward because of BRM policy. That producers would not want a drought-resistant seed because they're already buying crop insurance to take account of the financial impacts of drought. So is that what we want to incentivize with our BRM policy or not, and to what extent? So these are difficult questions, and questions we'll be tackling now and will be in the future.
Well, great stuff, Alan. Hey, we'll stay in touch, and we'll be looking to hear from you in the months and the years ahead. So thanks for taking the time.
Okay, thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it.